Good afternoon. Welcome to the Power of an Open Mind, a conversation with Dr. Jonathan Haidt. This event is sponsored by the Red and Blue Exchange, an initiative of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Paideia program at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm Sydney Nixon, a sophomore at Penn and a fellow in the Paideia program. Paideia serves as a hub for civic dialogue in the undergraduate education at Penn. We facilitate opportunity for students to develop the knowledge, skills, and ethical frameworks to be informed, engaged, and effective community members and leaders in society. Through SNF Paideia designated courses, the Fellows program that I'm a part of, events like tonight, we explore the role of dialogue in cultivating citizenship, belonging, and promoting individual and community wellness and enabling effective service to communities. The Red and Blue Exchange carries out this mission under the umbrella of the SNF Paideia with a special focus on dialogue across ideological differences. In addition to organizing events like this one, RBS hosts regular forums where college students from any school can gather on Zoom to engage in robust, meaningful, and moderate discussion about pressing political issues and, in the process, refine their skills for productive dialogue. Personally, I'm a proud and stubborn person, so even though I was able to recognize that everyone around me had some level of bias, I thought I was exempt. So it took an experience like Haidt's Open Mind program to prove me wrong. More importantly, I learned that there's nothing wrong with having biases because that's what makes us human, but it's what we do with them that matters. One of my favorite distinction Haidt makes is absorbing versus adjusting. Absorbing is when you take in new information that fits your pre-existing biases, but adjusting is when you encounter new information that doesn't fit and adjust your pre-existing mental structures to embrace it, seeking to learn rather than to be right. In addition, I was fascinated by the mental dichotomy of the elephant, our emotions and unconscious thoughts, versus the rider, which are our conscious and rational thinking. When confronted with information and viewpoints that contradict our own, it's easy for the elephant to take control and immediately reject those new ideas, which doesn't make for great dialogue. That's why I'm excited to learn more from Dr. Haidt about how we can all tame the elephants in our minds, embrace new realities, and allow ourselves to engage in more meaningful dialogue. Two brief notes before we begin. Penn students and alumni are invited to join a post-event dialogue hosted by the Penn Student Program Table Talk tomorrow evening, Thursday at 7 p.m. A registration link will be posted in the chat. We are grateful for the generous funding from the Gamma Foundation and the Stavros Niarchos Foundation that makes this event possible. I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for the evening, Dr. Jonathan Zimmerman. In addition to being one of my first professors at Penn, Dr. Zimmerman is a Julian Howard Berkowitz Professor at Penn's Graduate School of Education. He's a noted scholar of the history of education whose commentaries appear in many major American newspapers. His two most recent books are The Amateur Hour, A History of College Teaching in America, and Free Speech and Why You Should Give a Damn, due out in April. Professor Zimmerman, I'll turn it over to you to explain the format for tonight and introduce our featured guest.
Thank you so much, Sydney. I'm delighted to welcome my former NYU colleague, Jonathan Haidt, here at Penn, which is really a homecoming for John because he actually holds a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. I'm sure many people on this call are familiar with John's academic work, which includes the best-selling book, The Righteous Mind, and also The Coddling of the American Mind. I think more cognate to our purposes tonight, John's also the founder of two hugely important organizations. First, Heterodox Academy, which is devoted to promoting viewpoint diversity in the university. And secondly, Open Mind, which is a tool that Sydney just referred to, which is designed to help all of us open our minds and become more tolerant, more aware of, as Sydney put it, our own biases and the way they play in discussions or don't. I should tell you that I'm hardly an unbiased observer in this discussion. I'm a great fan of Jonathan Haidt and all the things he's done, and I feel honored to count him as a friend. So John, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, John. Thanks for inviting me to this. Thanks to you and Chris Satullo and all the others who've made Penn a real center of efforts to bridge the divides that are tearing our country apart. You began that work long ago, and boy, is it needed. Boy, do we see the need for it in just the last few months. So as you said, I got my PhD at Penn, and preparing for this talk, it's just really fun to think back on my time at Penn. I was there from 1987 to 1992. And while I loved my undergraduate years, I never thought that I was going to be a professor. It was really at Penn when I realized I was getting paid to read books and talk with people and go to talks, and this was going to be my life. And that's when I fell in love with the academy and being a professor. It was on the Penn campus, and the things I learned, the way my mind expanded by learning from so many different disciplines, including sociology as well as psychology. It was a time of enormous growth. And that actually leads into what I want to talk about today. Often I give a talk more focused on just viewpoint diversity and what it does. But I thought, thinking back, I thought, no, wait, let's think about what education is really supposed to do. Let's think about what a college education really should be. And then we'll get to this topic of how do you get smarter and stronger, which was promised in the title. So I'm going to share my screen. I'll speak for about 10 minutes because I think it's really important to frame a discussion, to put a sort of a common frame around things, a big picture, and then go into the details. So share screen, desktop one. And I think you should now all be seeing. John, just give me a thumbs up if you see my slides. All right. All right, so let's begin. Let's see, sorry, I'm at the bottom of the talk. There we are. Okay. All right, so I'd like to open with a big question, which is, what is the most fundamental question in life? And it's not, what is the meaning of life, or is there a God? Those are really advanced questions. Those are not fundamental questions. The most fundamental question that every organism has to answer as soon as it is able to move is approach or avoid. This is the most basic question in life. As soon as a single-celled organism can move, like this paramecium, it has to have some way of deciding, do I go towards the higher temperature or the lower temperature, the more salt or sugar, whatever it is, you have to have some equipment for deciding approach or avoid. And the entire history of evolution of animals after that is just commentary on this question. Brains evolve as we get multicellular organisms with nervous systems, brains evolve, and a fish's brain is just a really advanced way more advanced than the paramecium, of deciding approach or avoid. And that's why we have all these senses. Well, human brains take this to an exquisitely ornate level. We have vast tracts of cortical territory in the front left cortex that optimizes our approach cognitions and actions. And then we have specialization in the front right cortex for withdrawal, fear, avoidance actions and cognitions. Now, if this is the way life is organized and this is the way the brain is organized, how does this show up for us in daily life? And many psychologists have written about two basic modes. Here I'm using the labels from Caroline Webb's wonderful book, How to Have a Good Day, discover mode or defend mode. Those are the two basic modes. There are other ways of being, but those are the two most basic. We flip back and forth between them many times during a day. And what are they characterized by? In discover mode, we are looking for opportunities. Our senses are tuned. We're looking for possibilities, opportunities. It's really pleasurable. In fact, you might feel like a kid in a candy shop. I remember when the course catalog would come out when I was an undergraduate, the course catalog would come out. It was a thick blue book. And it was so exciting to flip through it. I would like open it randomly. Oh, Chinese, Chinese history and pottery, French, computer science. Like, it was like, traveling around the world in your mind and thinking, what country do I want to visit? So in discover mode, you feel like a kid in a candy shop and you think for yourself. You make your own decisions. You're not focused on what others demand of you. And if you're in this mode, sort of the motto of this mode, if you're going to take this as the guide to how you want to be in college, your motto would be whoever grows the most by graduation wins, or got the most out of college, or did college right. In contrast, in defend mode, we are constantly scanning for dangers. We don't notice opportunities because we're so focused on possible threats. We have a scarcity mindset. There's never enough. Life is a zero-sum game. People are trying to take my things. Scarcity is the opposite of a kid in a candy shop. We tend to cling to our team. because we feel as though we are threatened or under attack. And so we will cling to our team and we will do nothing that risks us being kicked off the team. We must have our team for protection. And the motto of this mindset is, if we defeat them, we win. Life is a battle and dangerous, and we have to fight them. Now, what mindset do you want to have in college? Okay, now that's one thing about mindset. Now let me bring in a second concept, telos, the Greek word telos, which was used in ancient Greek philosophy. Aristotle talked a lot about it to refer to the end or purpose of a thing or a practice or an occupation. So the telos of a knife is to cut. And if a knife doesn't cut, you can't say it's a great knife. I mean, you'd be making an error if you say it's an excellent knife, but it can't even cut a grape. What is the telos of a physician? To heal. What is the telos of a university? Well, this is a Raphael School of Athens. This is our conception of the academy. And we call it the academy because Plato called it his academy. And we descend intellectually from Plato and Aristotle and the history of Western philosophy originating in ancient Greece. And what they're doing here is not fighting, nor is it playing. It's talking, disputing, arguing, reasoning with each other. So they're engaged. You can see how engaged they are. And this is the life that I fell in love with at Penn. This is the life of a professor in an idealized form, that we do this all day long. No committee meetings, no letters of recommendation to write, no grant proposals, just talking about ideas all day long. Well, the telos of the university, I believe, is contained on the crest of many of our schools. Veritas, lux et veritas. If you look at, Penn is morals without, knowledge, wisdom without, my goodness, whatever it is, it's about morals and living a good life. That's another thing. We do think that universities should bring you up morally as well. But the central telos of American research universities is truth, finding truth. We have methods for finding truth, and we have methods for passing it on. That at least is the ideal. And so many of us, when we think back on our college years, last night I couldn't find a good photo of people sitting in front of Van Pelt or the Franklin statue. But we think about our college years as a time of just sitting around talking, meeting people, learning things. We have this, many of us, especially older people, we have this idyllic sense of what it is to be a college student. Now, I want to point out something that I just realized putting this talk together last night. What we have here is there's a psychological mindset, the discover mode. This is a product of evolution, and there's an institution, a university, which has evolved historically over the last 2,500 years. And there's a telos, namely finding truth. And these three have evolved to be perfectly complementary, so that when you have an institution that brings out this mindset in its students so that they all share the telos of truth. Now, they have other goals as individuals, but the reason we're together has something to do with finding truth in ways that are not possible or not easy outside of the university. This is a very specialized triangle that works brilliantly. So brilliantly that when you look at the list of the best universities in the world, well, if the university is made by, if the listing is made by an American organization, then it's all American plus Oxford and Cambridge, which are, of course, what we modeled our universities on, and then we did even better than them. Okay, in the UK, they have 3 UK universities, but then the rest are from the United States. By any stretch of the imagination, Anglo-American universities are the best in the world and have produced possibly most of the great innovations that are driving global progress forward. So this is a miraculous triangle here. Well, how are we doing today? Out of nowhere, it seemed, in the 2013 to 2014 academic year, something changed. And we started hearing suddenly about trigger warnings, students asking for trigger warnings because books, speakers, these were seen to be dangerous and people needed to be warned about them. It was as though suddenly many students were shifting into permanent defend mode. We saw a big increase in protests against speakers, many of whom were said to be dangerous or threatening, a threat to the students. And we first heard the term safe spaces. Now, of course, we had that from the UN in the Yugoslavia war, but the idea that students on campuses needed places where they would not encounter ideas that they found threatening was something that most of us, the faculty, we had a lot of trouble understanding. In retrospect, we can see that there was suddenly a big upsurge of defend mode thinking beginning in the 2014, roughly in the year 2014 plus or minus, a big upsurge in defend mode, a decline in discover mode. And the first person to really notice this and put a label on it was Greg Lukianoff, a friend of mine who is the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. Now, Greg is prone to depression, and he had a very serious depression in 2007. He made very specific plans to kill himself, and just before he did it, he called 911, broke down. They convinced him to commit himself to a hospital, and when he got out, he learned cognitive behavioral therapy, a very effective psychological technique in which you learn to recognize your distorted thoughts, like overgeneralizing, catastrophizing, dichotomous thinking, discounting the positive. You learn to notice these, and then you learn to question them, and then over time you train yourself. As Sydney pointed out, you got the elephant and the rider. You train the elephant to stop doing this to you, to stop tormenting you with these distorted thoughts. So Greg goes back to his job at FIRE, and suddenly, in this academic year, he begins to see students espousing the exact cognitive distortions that he had learned to stop doing. So before 2013, FIRE's work was always pushing back against administrators who were limiting student speech. It was never students asking for restrictions, but suddenly students at many campuses were asking for restrictions on speakers, books, classes, with a safety or health justification that this is dangerous, threatening, it makes me feel unsafe. And so Greg was, I think, the very first person to diagnose this, that something's going wrong with student cognitions. This is not the way to be thinking in college. And it came out of nowhere. So Greg invited me to lunch in May of 2014 to tell me his theory, because I'm a psychologist and I've written about CBT, and CBT, he says, saved his life. And I thought his idea was brilliant. So I volunteered to help him write it up as an article for The Atlantic. We submitted it in 2015, in January. It came out in August of 2015. And at the time, a lot of people thought we were exaggerating. It was just a few cases on a few campuses. But that fall at Yale, with the famous Halloween costume controversy, things really blew up, went national, no platforming, speaker shoutdowns, all these things grew and grew and grew. So much so that by 2017, Greg said, you know what, we need to expand this, we need to go deeper. So he suggested we turn it into a book, which we did, and it was a lot of fun to write. We went really deep into the causal threads. It was fascinating what we learned. So what is it that happened? What is it that suddenly changed around 2014? It was the emergence of a new moral culture, I would call it. I study moral psychology and sort of moral networks and matrices of meanings and emotions and beliefs. So suddenly we saw the emergence of a set of concepts, including safe spaces, trigger warnings, microaggressions, bias response teams, the idea that speech is violence, the idea that everything should be examined through the lens of power. Power is the appropriate academic lens to understand everything. And we get the emergence of a call-out culture in which a single word, your intention doesn't matter. If you use a word that someone can call you out for, you can get massively shamed. And so students suddenly start becoming much more afraid to speak up in class or in any sort of extracurricular. And we get, as one student said, my motto is silence is safer. Now that is a horrible way to go through college. That shows the loss of the discover mode and its replacement by widespread defend mode. So what happened was kind of a phase change in a complex dynamical system in which suddenly a few parameters changed and now defend mode dominates. Many students, not the majority, but many students think that they and other students are fragile, that they are in a dangerous and hostile place, that the university is a dangerous place, and they need protection by deans, professors, administrators. They need protection from words, books, and speakers. Now, what Greg and I did in the book is we found that we could group everything into three great untruths. 3 terrible ideas came flooding into universities around 2014, and they were the exact opposite of ancient truths that I wrote about in my first book, The Happiness Hypothesis. So what doesn't kill you makes you weaker became a prominent idea, that we have to avoid discomfort, when in fact, children are anti-fragile. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, with plenty of caveats. Always trust your feelings. No, don't. That's what Greg learned. Don't trust your feelings. Your feelings often lead you astray. You have to question them to figure out which ones are giving you reliable information about the world. And the most important, and the one we'll focus on today in our discussion, is life is a battle between good people and evil people. This is a very widespread and very ancient belief. It's called Manichaeism as a sort of a philosophical doctrine. But in fact, we are all prone to both tribalism, groupishness, and to dichotomous thinking, that we are good, they are evil. And this is ignorance. Wisdom, a liberal arts education, subtlety, all of this, great literature, all of this brings you to the realization that, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote, the line between good and evil cuts through the heart of every man. So I want to just give a brief example of this new way of thinking. An amazing essay was written by a student, Trent Eady, back in 2014, just as this way was beginning to emerge, called Everything is Problematic. Now Trent he describes himself as a queer activist since high school. He goes to McGill in Canada, and he becomes much more radical as when he's an undergraduate. But by his senior year, he realizes he's made a terrible mistake. He says, I used to endorse a particular brand of politics that is prevalent at McGill and in Montreal more widely. This particular brand of politics begins with good intentions and noble causes, but it metastasizes into a nightmare. And then he describes it. He says, I've pinned down 4 core features that make it so disturbing: dogmatism, groupthink, a crusader mentality, and anti-intellectualism. Now, this is the exact opposite of the mindset you need for a liberal arts education. If you bring these things to Penn or to any university, you've wasted your parents' money. You can't possibly learn if this is your approach. Basically, if you allow defend mode to dominate and us versus them thinking, you're wasting your time in college. And he says, thinking this way quickly divides the world into an in-group and an out-group, believers and heathens, the righteous and the wrongchous. Every minor heresy inches you further away from the group. When I was part of groups like this, everyone was on exactly the same page about a suspiciously large range of issues. Internal disagreement was rare. So what Eady is describing is a complete malfunction of this magic triangle, in which the mindset is defend, not discover. The telos is a certain kind of social justice. There's some kinds of social justice that I think are really compatible with a liberal arts education, but there's a certain flavor of it that I think is not. And I think when a university adopts this kind of social justice as its telos instead of truth, then it can't reach either one. So what Eady was diagnosing was, I think, the beginning of the decay of this magic triangle. Now, to end on a positive note, how can you actually make yourself smarter and stronger? There's a wonderful TED talk by Tyler Cowen, a really creative, interesting economist. And it's about how we think in stories. Many people know that. We think in stories, narrative, metaphors. But Cowen says there are many different kinds of stories. And one of our favorites is a good versus evil story. Absolutely. And he says, this is a great line. He says, as a simple rule of thumb, just imagine that every time you're telling a good versus evil story, you're basically lowering your IQ by 10 points. I think that is brilliant, because that's what happens. As soon as you see society or Penn or the presidency or global warming or anything, as soon as you say, I'm going to understand this complex system as a battle between perfectly good and perfectly evil people, as soon as you do that, you become dumb. You become unable to do nuance, and you become unable to understand the dynamics and to actually improve the system. So don't do this. Don't use this lens to understand complicated things. Instead, go with ancient wisdom from so many of the world's great religions. From Buddhism, a wonderful, this whole poem is gorgeous, but this line really got me. A Zen monk, Sensan, If you want the truth to stand clear before you, never be for or against. The struggle between for and against is the mind's worst disease. And most of the great religions tell us, they don't say, go out and get more angry, be quicker to judge and slower to forgive. No, they say the opposite of that. Be slower to judge and quicker to forgive. That way your relationships will go better and you will actually be able to find the truth. In the Jewish tradition, here's a line from Proverbs, iron sharpens iron, and one person sharpens the wits of another. And there are so many great quotes from the Talmud or from Talmudic scholarship. That's sort of the essence of Jewish intellectual practice, is the debate. It makes people smarter because they're coming together within the confines of a tradition and a moral order, and they get smarter together. And this is exactly the brilliance of John Stuart Mill. The greatest thing ever written about free speech and about the importance of speech is John Stuart Mill's book on liberty. Now, it's not long, but it is kind of hard going. But here's one of the key lines. He says, the only way in which a human being can make some approach to knowing the whole of a subject is by hearing what can be said about it by persons of every variety of opinion and studying all modes in which it can be looked at by every character of mind. No wise man ever acquired his wisdom in any mode but this: the steady habit of correcting and completing his own opinion by collating it, mixing it in with those of others, so far from causing doubt and hesitation, is the only stable foundation for a just reliance on it. In other words, we need other people to get smarter. People who agree with us don't make us smarter. We need to engage with people who think differently. To the extent that diversity makes us smarter, this is why. And so at Heterodox Academy, we took chapter 2 of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. It's the key chapter, and it's 15,000 words long, kind of dense. I worked with Richard Reeves, a Mill scholar, and we cut it by 50%. We removed redundant and weird historical analogies, made it much more accessible. So if you go to heterodoxacademy.org/Mill, you can download the PDF for free, or you can buy a Kindle for a version for $3. And especially if there are any professors watching this, it's a great resource for almost any class that is going to deal with contradictory opinions and political controversies. Also, as John and Sydney talked about, I co-developed Open Mind with Caroline Mell. So if you go to openmindplatform.org, again, any professor, any high school teacher, it works great in companies too. Many companies now are having a lot of conflict internally. This will give the group skills to listen, to learn from each other, and to work together. I won't go through the details about Open Mind, but I just want to end by saying, may you all find ways to spend almost all of your life, and certainly all of your time in college, in discover mode. Thank you. Okay. All right, let's talk.
Yes, John, thank you so much for that presentation. Let's start off with a little bit of history. I am a historian, and so I probably spent too much time wondering how our own moment is going to be explained in the future. It seems to me that Greg and you in Coddling an American Mind do a great job of elucidating this rise of what you call safetyism. But in 50 or 100 years, when historians try to explain why it happened at the moment that it did, what do you think they're going to say? Like, why now?
Yeah. So the way you have to see it, again, it's a complex dynamical system. It's not a machine where so it's a complex dynamical system. So there are various things, just as chemical reactions are different if the temperature is rising, or forest fires play out differently if the temperature is rising, the humidity is dropping. So there were certain conditions. And the vast change in parenting, the vast overprotection that American parents did just as the crime wave was ending. So you and I grew up during the crime wave, but kids played outside. And in the 1990s, the crime wave mysteriously recedes. We still don't know exactly why, but crime plummets in the 1990s. But Americans freak out about child abduction. So that's the exact time that we stop letting our kids out because we're afraid that they'll be kidnapped. Now, that was always a myth. There are hardly any abductions by non-custodial parents. It's usually a divorce issue why kids are abducted, or separation issue. So we overprotected kids. We also had vastly declining birth rates. So you don't have if you have lots of kids, they all go play outside. But if you have one kid and there are only 2 other kids in the neighborhood and they're all being kept indoors, they're all going to tutoring or whatever, there's no longer an outdoor life. At the same time, that same generation, basically kids born in 1996 and later, Gen Z, that's where everything changes. So we have this precipitating condition that Gen Z is deprived of the normal experiences of social interaction in childhood, of unsupervised play. It's incredibly important that kids have unsupervised play, because if they're supervised, they develop the skills of getting the adult to come in on their side. And that is called moral dependency. And that's what we saw exploding on campus in 2014, moral dependency. We can't work out this conflict. I am going to present my case to an administrator to punish that person. And that is a very bad way to go through life. It makes you not very useful to employers either. So that's a sort of a pre-existing condition, like a rising tide. There are a few others of those, but the real thing that changed in 2014 is that social media changed between 2009 and 2011. It wasn't polarizing before then, but by 2013, it became an outrage platform. And so I have an article in The Atlantic on this, and there's a lot of research now about how social media changed. Even though it comes out around 2004 with MySpace and the Facebook originally, that wasn't polarizing. That wasn't about outrage. That was just about, here are my friends, here are the bands that I like. 2009, Facebook adds the like button and Twitter copies it. 2009, Twitter adds the retweet button and Facebook copies it. So the big platform, and that's when they really grow. And before then, most adolescents were not on it every day. By 2011, the great majority were. So American teen life changed radically between 2009 and 2011, just as the platforms were changing. And now that they're optimizing for engagement, which means emotion and anger, now the news media has to adapt, because now everybody's flocking to these things to show their outrage in theatrical displays. So it's like the basic fabric of space-time, of social space-time, changed fundamentally between 2009 and 2011, and everything got weird during Obama's second term. The 2012 presidential election was the last normal politics we've had in this country. Everything got weird. It wasn't Obama's fault, but it just happened that everything changed, and that's what caused Trump to be elected. Trump could never have gotten elected before 2012, but because we now lived in a world of outrage, that allowed him to get elected. So that's the major thing that triggered very rapid change.
Yeah. Thank you. I just want to remind our audience that we're taking questions and comments. Please use the Q&A button. John, just a little follow-up on that short and wonderful history that you told. How much do you think things like student debt and just overall economic inequality, right, which is rife in this country, how much do you think they contribute to this kind of defense mode among students? I mean, especially among those who come from limited socioeconomic backgrounds.
Yeah, it's a very plausible hypothesis, but I don't think there's really anything to it, or I think that the patterns don't fit. So many have asked, why did it change? Because you got to know, this isn't just in the US. The exact same thing happens in Canada and the UK, and more attenuated Australia, New Zealand. I was there 2 years ago. So it's throughout the English-speaking world. It's not as much on the continent. It's not in the French or German-speaking countries as much. But the fact that it's, exact same stuff happens in Canadian universities, and they don't have this debt problem, same in Britain. So that's one thing. Another is that many have said, well, isn't it the economic collapse of 2008, 2009? I mean, isn't that, and that of course made people much more anxious and put a lot more stress on families and reduced opportunities. Isn't that what did it? But that would indicate that you'd start to see anxiety rise in 2009, 2010. And then of course, as the unemployment goes straight down from there, and the stock market goes straight up from there, and the economy improves steadily throughout Obama's second term. But yet, the rate of anxiety and depression keeps going up. So it's the opposite of what you would expect. So economic explanations don't work. They don't match.
And John, I mean, I think running through all this, like so much in our politics, is the question of race. Mm-hmm. So let's just try to address this as directly and frankly as we can, because I'm sure you've heard this objection many times, and it would go something like this: look, you're a white dude like I am, and it's easy for you to criticize this defense mode because you don't have to be defensive. You and your tribe, you run this ilk, you run this show. And so it's precious for you to say that other people shouldn't be defensive because you've never been in their shoes.
Mhm.
Obviously, I'm boundarizing, but you've heard this objection before. How do you reply to it?
Sure. Okay. Well, so first of all, to the extent that the difficulties and problems with this mindset show up in depression and anxiety, we're seeing rising depression and anxiety during this period. It doesn't quite match what you're talking about there. So, for example, we now have very good data. When we wrote the article in 2015, we didn't have good data on depression because it takes a couple of years from when something happens to when it's reported in the literature. And now we have very good data. And what we can see is that the rise in depression and anxiety has been substantially larger in women than in men, in whites than in blacks, and in people on the left compared to people on the right. Those are all average trends, but they interact. There's a three-way interaction so that something happened to the mental health of liberal white women in their 20s. So it's liberal white women in their 20s are the ones that really shot up in depression and anxiety, not Black women, not Black men. And there was a stunning data from Pew. When you break down the data, as Zach Goldberg did on Twitter, he posted these graphs. There was a question that Pew asked, have you ever been told by a health professional that you have a mental disorder? And almost every group is between 20 and 30%, or 35%, except for young white women on the left. Their rate is 56%. So I think what we're seeing is that there's a kind of activism. There's a kind of activism that emphasizes defense mode, that emphasizes the world is threatening. There are threats and dangers everywhere, even on my college campus. But it's not really African Americans who are showing the burden of this. It's, I think, the people who embrace that form of politics the most. And this was Greg's original observation, was that these ways of thinking in pursuit of social justice, just as Trent Eady said, if you're pursuing social justice in that way, it's incredibly demoralizing, and it leads you to depression and anxiety.
I mean, those numbers are really interesting because they also map onto some other numbers that I've seen where you ask college students about the perception of racism, like how much racism there is. And I've seen numbers suggesting that white females think there's more racism than anybody,
right?
Including like racial minorities,
mm-hmm.
Which is really interesting.
Yeah, and because you have to look at the politics of it. There's an amazing report from More in Common called the Hidden Tribe Study. And so if people just Google that, Hidden Tribe Study, and they did a cluster analysis. They had all kinds of attitude measures from 8,000 Americans. They used my Moral Foundations questionnaire as part of it. Then they do a cluster analysis, and they divide it up into 7 clusters, 7 tribes, they call it. And the whitest of all the tribes is the far right, and that's where we get the more authoritarians. That's where we get the white supremacists coming out of. But the second whitest group is the leftmost group, which they call the progressive activists. It's also the most female group. So again, there's something about the way that that politics has changed for this group, the progressive activists, that that seems to be particularly disempowering. And another thing they found is that all of the other 7 groups, everybody thinks political correctness is a problem. The majority of Blacks, the majority of whites, the majority of Republicans, the majority of Democrats, the majority of every group thinks political correctness is a problem, except for the progressive activists. So it's very much what Trent Eady was describing. Many of our young people, particularly young white women, are at elite, I should make it clear, at elite college campuses. There are thousands and thousands of college campuses. But many of them are moving into a kind of politics that I think is alienating most people. This is very important for the Democrats to understand. And that is, I think, at least correlated, and I think possibly causing mental illness.
So it's interesting. Yeah.
Oh,
so sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I just want to also address your other point about free speech is for white men so that they can sing racist songs or something like that. I've heard that argument a lot, and it sure doesn't help when Nazis hold a rally for free speech, and when Donald Trump champions free speech. So I understand why free speech, unfortunately, has become an issue that the right seems to be talking about more than the left, and the left is now wary of. But Greg Lukianoff is a First Amendment lawyer, and he knows the history of the First Amendment and of movements in the United States. And as he points out, powerful people always get to speak. In whatever country you're in, the powerful people get their views out. They don't need the First Amendment. They don't need guarantees of free speech. Historically, free speech is the friend of the oppressed, the marginalized, those who can be silenced. And so here are just a few quotes from Frederick Douglass. Slavery cannot tolerate free speech. It was the abolitionists and the activists who needed free speech, or they'd get shut down by the force of law in the South and even in the North. Here's a quote, and then the free speech movement in the 1960s, Mario Savio. So this is a left progressive movement demanding free speech on campus. And he said, free speech is the right to participate as citizens in a democratic society. And the progressive students, and then later all the way through the hippies, they were advocating for free speech. And here's a claim, I'll read this quote. Free speech does not require furnishing a podium for the speaker. I don't think you should lend these people the prestige of our university campuses for the presentation of their views. Well, who do you think said that? That sounds like the sort of thing that was said all over campuses in the last 5 years to justify not letting people like Milo Yiannopoulos or many conservative speakers to not let them speak. But that was said by Ronald Reagan in 1967 when he was governor of California, because until 5 years ago, free speech was primarily fought for by the left, and it was often the right that was opposing it. Things have only flipped. I mean, our world is really turning upside down very quickly, I think, again, because of the change in social media. But that argument that free speech is just for powerful people, I think doesn't really hold water.
And just a shameless plug, myself and Signe Wilkinson, a cartoonist, we have a book coming about free speech that tries to persuade people that it's a liberal, indeed a radical value. I mean, that's our goal. John, you mentioned activist a few times, use that word, and that actually picks up a really interesting question from the chat, which says, I often see the phrase scholar activists, but if the telos of a scholar is the pursuit of truth and the telos of an activist is the pursuit of an agenda, are its two components at odds? Yes. Can you be a scholar activist?
No, that is a wonderful question, and there's no easy answer, but I can begin to shed light on it. So I gave a talk on truth versus social justice as conflicting teloses, and I think an institution can have only one telos. So I argue, for years now I've been arguing, that a university must be clear that its telos is truth, not social justice. The purpose of the university is to train people, to teach habits of thinking, and to expand knowledge, which may well be useful for social justice projects. But if the university commits that our top goal is social justice, then the truth is really going to suffer. And then you get activists who are malinformed. And the history of reform movements probably has more big disasters than it has big successes. If you go out trying to tinker with complex dynamical systems and you're driven by anger or a limited view, you're probably going to make things worse. So, as professors, we're all supposed to admire activism and it's great that our students are activists. But the truth is, or I believe, that if students are coming into school with an activist mindset and getting trained as activists and they don't understand complex systems, they shouldn't try to change things because they're going to make things worse. They don't understand. And that's why, year after year, decade after decade, a lot of our social problems don't get solved because people are approaching the partisan mindset and they don't understand the system or the facts.
Right, now, but John, aren't you an activist for things like Open Mind?
That's right.
Moreover, I mean, and I've felt this myself, aren't you sort of defensive about the discovery mode? I feel that very deeply myself. I believe in you and what you're saying, and I believe in this difference, but I also feel defensive about protecting the discovery mode. Does that make sense?
Well, let me take, so you got two different things there. First, aren't I a scholar activist myself? The answer is yes. And that's why I said, like, okay, it's complicated and I'll just begin because I am wrestling with this. So generally scholars don't try to apply their work. We have a division of labor. We're supposed to just publish stuff and then activists or business people or whatever, they take, and so there's a division of labor and there's a lot of sense in that. But there are also a lot of professors who do try to apply their work. And many in education, in sociology, social work. And is there a danger of corruption? That is, so if it was just, oh, I take my work and I try to apply it honestly, but isn't there a danger that once I get into applying it and I'm in conflict with other people or groups, won't that cause me, and look, I wrote the book, The Righteous Mind, which is all about how we do post hoc reasoning. So yes, I am in danger of that. And that would be a form of corruption if I change my scholarship to back up my, my projects. That's true. The reason why I think it's okay, or rather the reason why I'm not quite in the same boat as what I'm criticizing here, is that if you are going to try to change a system, you should have years of study of it before you try to change anything. And so this is like basic Edmund Burke, we should operate on society as we would operate on our father. Like, yes, you'll do the operation, but not casually. You're going to study for a long time. And I think after, I didn't do any activism of any kind or any application for, until 20 years of studying moral psychology. And so, I'd be happy if we had a general, not exactly a policy, but a norm that freshmen and sophomores should not get involved in activism. They should really devote themselves to learning. And then maybe by junior or senior year, after you've studied a problem, now you can get involved in activism. Again, I wouldn't make it a rule, but I would make it a recommendation. That's the first thing. The second thing is where activists really go wrong is that they're part of a passionate group which often has quasi-religious characteristics. So that's the groupthink, that's the mindset. Now, I'm a political centrist in a world of people on the left and people on the right. I don't have a tribe, I don't have a gang, there's no way you'll get a mob of centrists. There was that, was the rally for sanity that Jon Stewart had, what do we want? Evidence-backed change. When do we want it? After peer review. So yes, I am in danger of biasing my scholarship, true, but I'm not in danger of being part of a kind of a quasi-religious, group that will shun me if I question something. Like I'm not in a group where if I question something, I'll be kicked out.
You feel defensive about defending the discovery mode.
Why do you say that? I don't understand. Why am I defensive about it?
Well, I mean, because it's under challenge and it requires protection and defense.
Wait, I'm sorry. A mindset requires defense? I don't understand.
Well, I mean, it seems to me that the thrust of your talk is that at the university, a lot of people are flouting the discovery value or ignoring it, right?
Yes. Okay, fine.
Doesn't it require defense?
Okay, I'll defend defense mode. We have it because it was adaptive. In the world that we lived in, there were dangers everywhere. My family we visited Botswana. We went to the giant game reserves. We saw, it's unbelievable the way death can come at any moment. And it's a constant struggle. And then after death, the incredible conflict for the carcass. I mean, this is what life is like before civilization. So that's why animal brains and human brains evolved this way. We have the defense mode for a reason. We don't live in that world anymore. And a college campus is the least like it anywhere. So, if we're talking about physical danger, and obviously, there's sexual assault, there's rape from the surrounding community or from other students. Those dangers, that's a huge advance. There was much more drunken sexual assault when you and I were in college. So that I'm totally on board with. That has to change, and it has changed. The numbers I believe, are way, way down. But if you then make things more physically safe, and by just about every measure, children are more physically safe than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago, from accidents, from crime, from nuclear war. I mean, we're so much more physically safe. But if we take that gain and we say, let's not adjust in fact, let's not shift more towards discover mode. Let's actually emphasize new threats. Let's find new threats. They're smaller, but we're going to amplify them. So that way we can be even more in defend mode than we were back when it was physically dangerous. So yes, I believe it is wrong for us to shift more into defense mode rather than decade after decade more into discover mode. Now, is that a good enough defense, or do you want to defend it more?
No.
You think that students should spend half their time in defense mode?
No, definitely not. But
okay, I think so what's our argument?
There are values that we all need to rally around and defend. important university values that you spelled out in your talk that are being ignored or flouted. That's all. Going to the chat. Somebody asks, look, you've made a plea for having viewpoint diversity and different ideas. The writer says, are there places where he would draw the line? E.g., speakers who are essentially being provocative for their own sake, speakers who argue based on misinformation, arguments that are overly personalized or hurtful. Are there viewpoints that you would keep out, even though you're an advocate of viewpoint diversity?
Okay, so that's a great question, but that is not the right question. That is, I totally understand what the writer is getting at, and it is a question we have to address on campuses. But these discussions are insoluble and contentious if you don't specify the institution. So if you just say, are there viewpoints we shouldn't allow? Well, do you mean like we should arrest the people? Like, no, in America, we say, no, you don't get arrested for your viewpoints. In Europe, you could. There are a few viewpoints in Canada where you can get arrested for your viewpoint. But in America, we say, you're not going to get arrested. But if you specify the institution, so are we talking about in a for-profit company? In a for-profit company, they can regulate speech all they want. Are we talking about on the public square? Well, then no, you can't really regulate speech. Or are we talking about a university? And I assume the writer is talking about a university. Once we specify the institution, now everything becomes easy, because now it's very easy. If somebody wants to come and say the earth is flat, why would we let them on? They're not, that's absurd, and they have no evidence. But if there was a geologist who came and he could prove with data and satellite photos that the earth was flat, I think it's bizarre, but we'd have to let him on. Now that is never going to happen. But if a bona fide researcher with credentials has evidence of something that we don't want to believe, yes, of course we should let him on. Of course we should. Now, if he's going to come on and yell and scream and insult people, no, he's not an academic. He's not a professional. We don't, keep your mind laser focused on our telos. Our telos is truth. So people who come to provoke, no, they don't advance our telos. People who come with research that ends up being provocative, great. That really does advance our telos.
Another question from the chat, also about the discover and defend mode. Can social media be tamed or altered to promote discover mode rather than defend mode?
Absolutely it can. Absolutely. And this is, I think, what has to happen if we're to save our democracy, frankly, because if things keep going the way they're going, we're finding out in the last 7 years or so, democracies are much less stable than we thought in the 1990s, when we thought every country was going to end up a liberal democracy. Yes, we all know that there are places on the internet where people are very supportive and kind, and there are places that are cesspools like Twitter. And the key, I believe, is first recognize that on the major social media platforms, the customer is the advertiser and the user is the product. And so they are finely tuned to deliver value to the customer. So that's a fundamental problem. The business models are just wrong for our democracy. What I've been trying to argue for is that, and I've spoken to people at the major tech companies, what I'm trying to argue for is we've got to, if this really has become our new public square, this really has become crucial, this is the heart of democracy, is debate, dialogue, discussion, then we have to make it a place that people aren't afraid of being mugged and kicked and spat upon, because that's what it is now. And so most people don't want to speak up. Who speaks up? The most aggressive people, especially on the far left and the far right. So they're all focused on, well, we're going to do more content moderation. Okay, that's helpful. But here's what would really, really do it. Just give us, AI can do this easily. You code each person, each user, for cognitive complexity, aggression, obscenity, things like that. You give them a rating. An AI could easily do that. Everybody gets a rating. And now I can set a slider switch. You know what? Someone who just screams in all caps and they have a cognitive complexity score of 0, I don't want to hear from them. And I don't want them to see me. They disappear from the public square, as far as I'm concerned. That would, first of all, create a public square where I would actually be much freer to talk. Everyone would be much freer to talk. And especially as we know, in these public squares, women African Americans, a few other groups get slimed, get racist and death threats much more than other people. So this would instantly make those people disappear. The bad people would disappear. So with just one, give us a couple of parameters to change, and this complex dynamical system would have very different properties.
So John, you mentioned the metaphor customers, and that actually links to another question that we got, which is, does the fact that universities cater to students like customers affect how much can be done about these problems on campus?
Yeah. Oh, yes, it is a big problem. And Greg and I have a chapter, chapter 10, I think it is, on changes to the bureaucracy. And in the 60s, there are many stories of great university presidents who are heroic in all kinds of ways, and almost always concordant with what we would call liberal values. And by liberal, I mean the liberal tradition, not left-right necessarily. So there were a lot of examples of that in the 60s and 70s of strong university presidents. But since then, tuition has shot up. The need to be a fundraiser is become the #1 thing that takes up time of presidents, I think, or many of them. And we've had a complete cultural shift so that the student is the customer. The customer is always right. We're a much more consumer society. And especially the top universities, or most of the universities, it's not just that, oh, we need the tuition dollars. It's much more about prestige. They're all fighting for limited prestige. And so it's a market that doesn't quite work, because even though the product being delivered to the customer is rising in price and declining in value, normal capitalism is not working because we don't have real competition among the universities for customers. The parents are desperate to send their kid to the highest status school, even if the quality of the offering is worse.
So now, John, we get to some advice questions for you. So this is a really interesting one. I'm a 16-year-old researching how the attention economy targets teens to their use of social media. What do you suggest are the most practical ways to nudge this age group to limit use of social media, both to improve their mental health and to protect them from being manipulated?
Great question.
Yeah.
So the most important thing I want people to know, if we switch this subject of teen mental health, we haven't really been talking about that as much. So in the Coddling, we argue that it's the overprotection, the loss of unsupervised experience is part of it, and the other is social media, which explains why it's so much harder on girls than boys. Boys are online all the time, but they're playing video games, which are not harmful. They're not harmful to mental health, at least. Girls are spending much more time on social media. And girls are much more harmed by constant social comparison, especially in the visual mode, about their looks, their body weight, their weight. So social media, I think, is the main cause of the explosion, the doubling of depression among American teenage girls, Canadian, British. So social media is really a huge problem for teen mental health, I believe. And I don't think TikTok is particularly bad. TikTok is fun. It's more about showing creativity, but especially Instagram and Facebook and a few others. They don't use Facebook, but Instagram and a few others. The thing to keep in mind is that it's not like a dose response thing where if an individual consumes less of it, like less sugar, they'll be healthier, because it's a network thing. It's the whole nature of teen social interaction has changed and has moved online. So one person can't, you can remove yourself from it, but then you're cut off. So it's not necessarily going to be good for you. So what I would say to the questioner is, you've got to see this as a network problem. You've got to see it as a social dilemma that you have to solve as a group. And so if you go to thecoddling.com and then solutions, better mental health, we have 2 giant Google documents that have all of the studies we can find about whether teen mental health is worsening. And yes, it is. There's no debate about that. And another one, is social media a contributing cause? And there is debate about that, but I think the evidence is pretty strong that it is. So I would urge, get a discussion group among all your friends or at your school and present the evidence that this is harming them. And I find when I speak, this is one of the great things about Gen Z is that they are not at all in denial. So when I used to speak at universities and high schools, and I would present this case, and Gen Z, you're coddled, you're weak, you're overprotected, you've got depression, anxiety, you've got a dark future. They never get angry. They never say, you're wrong. They say, yeah, you're right. You're right. What can we do? So, to the 16-year-old, I can almost guarantee you that if you talk among your friends, a lot of them are going to agree about the problem and want to work with you on a solution. And so for starters, I would say, try to find ways to get together in person more often. And especially try to, if you want to be an activist, try to change norms in middle school. Because that's where the problems really explode. That's where kids get online. That's where the depression rates start going up. That's where middle school kids did not used to cut themselves, but now middle school girls are cutting themselves at rates 3 times higher than what they were 10 years ago. So try to change norms for younger kids so that they spend more time actually interacting unsupervised and less time online with each other.
Right, right. So here's another kind of advice question, John. Do you have advice for decreasing our own defensiveness and confirmation bias? I feel like I avoid some information sources that I expect to disagree with because I'm afraid they'll simply make me dig my feet in even more.
Yeah. Yeah, I do. Get curious. So I was always on the left, and I started working on the righteous mind because I was so tired of the Democrats losing elections, like in 2000, 2004, and I set out to try to understand conservatives at that time, in part because I wanted to offer better advice to Democrats. So I was actually becoming, as many researchers are, sort of activists, like using academic research to help, political parties and candidates. And that is, I think, a kind of corruption. I no longer think it's really appropriate. But so what I did was I started, TiVoing. Back then there was a thing called TiVo. I would, TiVo, Fox News. I started watching Glenn Beck and O'Reilly and a bunch of them. And at first it was like getting into a cold pool. At first it's really unpleasant. Once you get used to it, it's totally fascinating because some of them are actually really entertaining. And if you think like you're learning about them rather than reacting to them, what they want is to trigger outrage in their viewers. But if you go in and say, you know what, I actually want to understand this. And if I actually want to work against it, I better understand it. Otherwise, I'm just yelling in the wind. So get curious, take the plunge. And you might find at first, I felt some feelings of disgust and resistance, but that faded away pretty quickly. And I just found it fascinating. And when I'm driving in rural areas, I always listen to like Christian radio and right-wing talk radio. It's just fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, look, I agree with you, but I should confess this is a problem in my house because I too watch Fox News because I want to understand it. And I know that if I watch CNN or MSNBC, that just all my worldviews will be confirmed. But after about 10 minutes, my wife kicks me out and makes me go watch in another room because it gets her blood boiling, and it makes her so angry. I mean, it is designed to generate a certain kind of anger. Or some of it.
It's designed to generate a certain kind of anger in conservatives, and so when
Correct.
liberals watch it, they get even more angry.
Yeah.
But that's the polarization cycle we're in. If you want to know what is energizing the far right, why is the far right so strong? Historically, first of all, conservatism arises in every era as a reaction to the excesses of the left. So there is no definition of conservatism other than that it's trying to conserve, but it always sees a threat from the left. That was true in the French Revolution, and so conservatism then meant a different thing than it does now. But you have to see the complex social dynamics. Progressives are always trying to progress. We need progressives. We need people to question, challenge, say, why do we have this? Why is marriage just for men and women? It doesn't have to be that way. So we need people on the left, we need progressives to push for change. But then we also need people on the right to say, slow down, wait. We're not going to just knock this thing down. And that's, again, the wisdom of Edmund Burke. And if you have progressives with no brake on them, you get the San Francisco school district, which can't educate, it just does culture war stuff. So we need a balance between a progressive force and a conservative force. And the more one goes crazy, the stronger the other gets. So if you want the Democrats to lose the House in 2022, do as much woke stuff as you can. Push for the woke agenda, and the Democrats will lose.
So here's another advice question, John. Do you have strategies for leading others out of the defense mode during political conversations? So you're in a conversation with somebody who's in the defense mode. How do you bring them out of that?
It's actually, well, it's hard, but it's doable. And there's 2 major steps, I would say essential steps. 1, don't do it in public. Don't do it in front of an audience. If there are 10 people watching, or if it's on social media, it's totally hopeless. And there is research showing that if something is an identity issue, if it's related to what their identity is, it's very hard to change. So number one, don't even try it in a group setting. A lot of companies in Silicon Valley used to have all hands meetings or ask me anything. The CEO would appear and everybody could ask anything, because they modeled their culture after college. That's what Google and the other companies did. They wanted this big, open, free speech, free-for-all thing.
Yeah.
But you know what? A college culture now isn't very good. And they've all learned, whoa, if you do that, you just get this explosion of anger and most people are silent. So don't do it in public. Do it one-on-one. Second, start by acknowledging something that they're right about, or something that, if you're on different sides, something you think your side is wrong about. And this has a magical effect, because again, the stronger you hit your opponent, the harder they're going to resist and the angrier they're going to get. So if you go in saying you're wrong and here's why, that's how to lose. But if you go in and say, we disagree on a lot of things, but I got to admit, you care about this, and I think you're right. And then that instantly changes their mindset, because their defensive mindset is for battle, and you're saying, I don't want to fight you. I want to talk and I want to learn from you. And instantly that relaxes them. Their guard goes down. And then they're much more motivated, because reciprocity is deep in our minds. They're much more motivated. It's clear you've made a concession. And at some point, they're going to make a concession and say, well, okay, and maybe I was wrong to really emphasize this. I think this is what I really care about. But yeah, okay, you're right in that. And then you have a productive discussion going.
So John, this is something I think about all the time. How do we scale that up? That is, how do we make a collective will for that kind of activity? I want that, right? But so often I just feel like I'm just fighting these speaking of defensiveness, just these enormous forces working against it. Like, how do we convince people that would be a good thing?
It's hard to convince people that it would be a good thing. Now, most people, again, in that Hidden Tribe study, over 70% were what they call the exhausted majority. People are fed up with this. They don't want to see so much acrimony. Most people are reasonable. Most people are somewhere near the middle, center left, center right, centrist, or non-political. So most people support it, but it's always been the case that the extremes are louder and have more of a platform. And then when social media came along, they got much louder, and the middle 70% got quiet. So the dynamics are totally messed up right now. And so that middle 70% hates it. They're sick of it. They don't want it to be that way. So most people will be responsive to this. And you really get change, or you can scale it up by being, again, sophisticated about the social psychology. So a discussion in the public square is kind of hopeless. But if it's in a family or a synagogue or a university or a classroom or a company, and you emphasize what we have in common, and you emphasize we have shared fate, and we have a long future, and we have a long history, those are the things that put people in a mindset where they actually would like to work things out if they could. So you've got to get the conditions right. And I think it's especially remarkable. So the most powerful examples I've seen of this, of people melting away opposition, they tend actually to be religious Christians, often African-American Christians. So from Martin Luther King through Daryl Davis, many people have seen, or just Daryl Davis is this incredible, he's a blues pianist who found himself talking to a Klansman in a bar after he was playing, and he just listened to him. He talked to him, and over time, he actually developed a friendship with him, and he got the guy to give up his robes and come out of the Klan. He's now done this hundreds and hundreds of times by listening to people. So, and what I've noticed, and then also Hawk Newsom, there's a story we tell in the Coddling the American Mind, got this Trump rally to like totally change its feelings. But so I think there are certain, like religious Christians have certain moral resources of forgiveness, humility. Now, of course, Jews can do that too. There is plenty of scripture on that too. So it's hard to do in the abstract, but if you have a common identity and a set of moral resources to appeal to, And so at Penn, like the worship of Franklin, I was at UVA, it was the worship of Jefferson. These things that unite people. Now, of course, Jefferson has become a divisive topic even at UVA. I hope Franklin hasn't been canceled yet, has he?
No, we won't allow that.
Okay.
It's interesting. There was a point in the chat about Daryl Davis. So obviously people are channeling you. Here's another question I think kind of bringing us back to the university itself. How can undergraduate students contribute to promoting viewpoint diversity on their campuses? Like if you're a college kid, what do you do about this?
Yeah. First, social change is hard to do alone, but know that you have a lot of support, that we have all kinds of surveys at Heterodox Academy. We just put out a study. Most people are afraid to speak up, especially about issues of gender, race, and politics. They're afraid to speak up in their class, and they're afraid mostly of the other students, not of the professors. So know that you have a lot of support. Be the change you seek. Reach out to people. Now look at there must be some undergrad organizations. So obviously there are the initiatives that you've been part of, Jonathan, but there's a wonderful group called Bridge USA. If you just Google Bridge USA, it's a student group started at Notre Dame and Berkeley and a few other schools. Now there's dozens of chapters. I'll look to see if there's one at Penn. If there isn't one at Penn, undergrads, start one. It's exactly what you're talking about here. And if there is one at Penn, join it. There's also living room conversations. If you Google living room conversations, they have a formula for having groups of 4. It was always just 4 people. So there are ways of hosting conversations.
Yeah, and we've been doing that at Penn. I mean, that's what Can We Talk is about. I mean, thanks to Chris Satullo and Harris Sokolov, we try to bring people together. I think we've had some success there, but there's always this feeling on my part that we're kind of preaching to the converted, in the sense that people who are disposed to enter a conversation like that, you kind of already have them, right?
That's right.
It's like, what do you, the tough nut is like, what do you do with the people that don't want that conversation at all?
Yeah. So you have to make it more prestigious, and it'll be hard to get the extremes, and people are really caught up in the virtue signaling and the grandstanding and all that. It'll be hard to reach them. But one thing I'm beginning to emphasize, since I teach in a business school, something I'm beginning to emphasize is that this is an essential skill for success in business and in the corporate world. You talk to almost any CEO in certain industries, not everywhere, but in the high prestige creative industries. So journalism, tech, advertising, media, the nonprofits, arts, a few others. In those fields, almost everybody's on the left, and the leaders are like freaking out that there's, it's always a crisis. And it's a crisis because somebody said something to somebody else, and now the whole company's in crisis. And it's week after week, this is constantly happening. And so if companies can find people aren't going to do that, who can actually coexist with somebody who voted for the other party, or somebody who makes a verbal slip, if they can coexist with that person, yes, we will hire you because we can, you will actually add value to the company, whereas many employees are actually subtracting value from the company.
So, John, we're gonna have to wrap up shortly, but I'm really glad that you mentioned religion, because that's been something I've been thinking about as we've been talking. Do you think our future historian who's trying to explain this moment might explain part of it in terms of declining church and synagogue and mosque attendance, and declining just identification with the religious faith, given the kind of bridging functions that you were describing earlier? I mean, is that part of the problem here?
Oh, yes, I do believe that it is a part. If you take the big sociological historical perspective, I do believe it's part of the problem. So the subtitle of The Righteous Mind is Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And I interpret politics and sports as manifestations of our ancient groupishness, which evolved, religion, we evolved to be religious, which means we can form groups not based on kinship, like some other animals, but based on shared worship of a sacred object or value. So this is very deep in our nature. Small scale religions, very deep in our nature. And then we have a few thousand years with large scale religion, where most people are Christian or Muslim. And these are part of the huge rise of civilization. And then we have the very rapid collapse of participation in large-scale religion in the last 50 years, in Europe especially, but also in America. So my view is our minds are religious, our minds evolved for gods, multiple gods, but our minds evolved for religion. And when you take religion, actual religion out, you've got a system ready for a god. It's almost like the Minions, you know, in the Minions movie, they need an evil person to, you know, to worship. So that gets filled up very quickly. So you can see that. So, you know, a lot of young men are attracted to far right and even, you know, neo-Nazi stuff. They're ripe for recruitment. But this is very much, you know, I've got a list of over 20 essays that have made the case that wokeness is exactly a religion. I mean, John McWhorter has been writing this. He was one of the first to really put his finger on in 2017. What we now see as wokeness is bizarre unless you see it as a form of Christian worship. So yes, if people were Christians, they wouldn't embrace either. Well, okay, we do have Christian nationalism on the right, so it's complicated. But yes, the withdrawal of religion has left people on the left, because the right is still more religious. People on the left are now more prone to more cultish sorts of ideologies.
Well, on that very depressing note, I think we have to draw to a close here. I'm going to turn it over to Sydney for the sign off. John, thank you so much for the conversation.
Oh, thank you, John.
Yeah. Sydney, over to you.
Hi, thank you. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much for being part of the Power of an Open Mind this evening. Before we finally wrap up, just a few points. We want to thank the Gamba family, whose generosity to the Red and Blue Exchange made this event possible. As you see, the SNF Paideia program has a number of events coming up. The follow-up discussion of today's program, sponsored by the student-run Table Talk, is open to Penn students and alums. It's similar to a group like Bridge USA. If you're a student or have one in your life, be aware the next Can We Talk forum is a week from tonight on Zoom. Students from any campus are welcome. Topics will include vaccination, ethics, student stress, democratic reform, and a little bit of Meghan Markle. You can sign up on the Paideia site. The video of this event will be available on that site soon. Tomorrow, look for your inbox for an invitation from us to evaluate this event through a survey. The link will be going up in the chat now as well. Thank you again to Dr. Zimmerman and Dr. Haidt for a fascinating conversation.